Part 2, Chapter 25 of If All These Young Men by Romer Wilson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Part 2, London. Chapter 25, Hampstead Heath. The following evening was particularly fine and beautiful. The beauty of the last few days was aged and come to its prime, and the blue air, warmed by the declining sun, was filled with golden light. Josephine and Sebastian came out of a little eating-house in Soho, and in the evening sunshine they appeared to have gained in individuality and significance, to be each a rounded and a finished being, detached from the mass of humanity, and the people in the streets had the same quality. Josephine looked up at the sky and said, "I wish I was in the country." Sebastian looked upward also into the height of heaven over the gay sunlit town. "Yes," he answered, "I want to go down to Boxwell House for the weekend if I can." They stood a minute gazing up into the sky, and then Josephine lowered her glance among the shadows creeping imperceptibly up the walls of the houses and said, "Shall we go to Hampstead Heath?" "Let's! Come on," he replied without spontaneity. "If you want to, I am quite ready to do anything." Josephine looked at him. He seemed wearier than ever, drawn, lank, and bleached in the night of war. She said, feeling that she must not tire him or put him to any trouble on her account, "Well then, let's go. There is a bus from outside the palace." In a minute they passed the front of the palace music hall with its window boxes filled with white daisies and pink geraniums, and presently stood outside a sweet shop full of highly colored sweets and waited for an omnibus. Josephine was glad to be out alone with Sebastian again. She felt at rest to be with somebody who made no demand upon her other than the simple demand of her consideration. And Sebastian, though his feelings were lost in the cold pain at the back of his head, was aware of ease in his heart, as if in her company life were simple. "It must be grand," said Josephine after a little while, "to be liked by everybody." "Grand," he answered indulgently, using her word, and as he spoke looked up and saw the omnibus coming, and thought for a minute that the space around him was his own kindness, and that the omnibus had come into it. He awoke to reality, and they climbed onto the top, and Josephine said, with a smile which she rarely used, "Can we both sit on one seat, or are you too large?" "I think we can," he replied, with a slight suggestion of gallantry in his voice. "At least we will try. I think there is more room on the ones in front." As they sat down, he took off his hat and sighed. "I can't sleep at night now." "Poor lad," said Josephine. "I have nightmares. Last night I thought a monkey was trying to get in at my window." "I think at night," said Josephine, "until I wish I could never think again." She looked over the rail of the omnibus at the people moving along below. Everything in the street was moving. Then suddenly everything in the street appeared stationary, and the houses and roads seemed to slip by. The next second everything was as before. "I suppose it's work and the war," she said. "They both go on all night. One doesn't know whether one is thinking straight. Is thought karyokinetic? That's the kind of ideas I have. It is horrible anyhow." Sebastian put his arm through Josephine's, not out of sympathy, but because he felt it would be nice to do so. "I feel," continued Josephine, "as if the whole of everything had got the thin edge of the wedge into my brain, and was beginning to force a way through me." The girl came for the tokens, and Sebastian withdrew his arm and paid, and after that they sat in silence, because Josephine did not expect a reply, and if she had, he could not have made one up at the moment. The omnibus lurched along indefinitely as if it were going nowhere, and the warm wind streamed up into their faces. They neither of them cared how long it took to reach the heath, as the motion was pleasant and they were not anxious to walk. "I don't think we will do much walking," said Josephine, and Sebastian answered, "No. We will go to the top of Heath Street and look round, and if we don't fancy it, we will come back." "Yes," he said, drawing infinitesimally nearer to her, but she perceived it. After a time, with an effort, she turned round to him and said, "Sebastian, I have been thinking a great deal lately, too much no doubt, about how lonely everybody is. People hate me. I don't get on with folk. I think I only like simple people. I am going to be a simplicity crank. I don't get on with anybody, it seems, except Susan." To this Sebastian replied nothing. "And yet I am not unhappy," she continued. The omnibus stopped and they got down, and Josephine hurried so as to be able to talk again. Directly they began to walk, she continued, "I don't know why I am not unhappy, but there seem such grand things in the world, the war and all. You see that house," she said, pointing out a house set back in a little garden of dirty ivy and straggling plants. "I feel as if everything of this past year came out of that house. I once lived there. God! I have been miserable, but now, since Easter, everything seems to be altering. I did it late in life, but I think I struggled through a second adolescence last year. I became of age again at Easter. Since then, in spite of the opened-out feeling I had of losing England, I have been happy. Perhaps when you have fixed with yourself not to fear anything, you feel better. Did you go to the opera last night?" she concluded, to relieve him of the embarrassment of silence. "Yes, I went and stood somewhere up at the top," he replied, and neither of them spoke again, but Josephine's ideas went up and down the past, and then came to settle upon Susan's sadness with which the last day and night had been filled. When they got to the top of the hill into the golden sky of the setting sun, she sighed, and forgetting human life, went and stood on that spot from whence she could best see the west, and Sebastian came and stood beside her. He lost his sense of shadow and coldness, and with a smile on his face blinked into the sun which was about to go down behind the hills. In all the harmonies of blue the landscape spread away further and further from below the hill on which they stood, in circular ripples of woods and hills and city, like an ocean. Overhead the sky had rolled away, disclosing only the immeasurable golden glory of sunlit space. And as the sun touched the first hilltop, white light broke out from it, which, melting hill and valley and town, revolved between the deep blue of earth and the gold of heaven, as if from it sprung all creation. The edge of the world inclined slowly up, and the revolving light drew in, to be metamorphosed into broad, expanding rays, which seemed to reach from the source of time into the uttermost parts of infinity. Slowly now soft silver clouds gathered toward the center of the light, and the dying day expired to the imagined voices of the air far off in visionary beauty. Sebastian stood still, his eyes staring upon the spectacle of the sunset, his mind vacant, his imagination in accord with nature, and as the light lit up his figure there was only conscious thought needed to join nature and his mind, and produce the absolute expression of a beauty which time and natural air made tolerable to the human eye. In spite of his habitual retreat from his share in ownership of the world, he became to the glory of the light before his eyes in the same relationship as man thinks himself to God, the first recipient of its divinity, the perceiver of its beauty, the complement of its significance. The young woman beside him, who through the fall of man should, under divine and human law, have sought the meaning of creation in his face, was filled with a sense of inexhaustible beatitude, and out of her heart came compassion toward the world, as if she were not only a human being, but a part of that in which the human progress holds its course. At length they moved, and as if they were alone in the primeval world, they took one another's hand, and Josephine said, "Sebastian, let us walk down onto the heath. The sun has gone down behind the hills." The beauty of the first evening in Eden surrounded them. As soon as Sebastian detached himself from nature, he surrendered himself without feelings of sentimentality or emotion to Josephine, and walked down with her among the trees and bushes which were green with mid-May leaves. In the twilight of the sun, reflected down from the blue sky already deepening in the approaching shadow of the earth, the leaves upon the trees shone bright like glass, and on the verdant green slopes such flowers as May brings to the city made little white stars. Josephine and Sebastian felt well and handsome, and thought they walked about a cubit above the level of the grass. At the bend of the hill they passed several couples, some sitting upon the ground, some walking about, and all posed as if the heath were a park in a fairy tale, where every attitude of love were to be seen, and both Sebastian and Josephine desired to take up a sentimental posture and become a group, because it seemed ridiculous to walk about coldly holding hands. At this point Josephine said, "I think we had better be going back." "Why?" he asked. "Oh, very well," she answered. "Don't go home yet, it's quite early." He slipped his arm round her neck and then laughed. "Now we are doing like the rest," she said, with considerable courage, and he took his arm away. They both laughed now from the heart, and walked on hand in hand. "It is a jolly evening," he said. "Yes," she replied, and ran half‐way up the hillock in front, away from him. She thought she was like Diana, and felt both beautiful and young. Sebastian did not attempt to follow her, so she ran down again and walked sedately beside him. Sebastian put his arm roughly round her neck once more and laughed, and for some reason she put up her hand to push him away, but he took hold of it in a clumsy, countrified fashion, as if he were quite new to the game, and said, "Josephine, Josephine," and gave her a kiss. She brushed it away, and he said, "No, no," and gave her two more. She tried to loosen his fingers, which were getting tighter on her shoulder, but he only drew her closer. "Oh my," she said, "the supremacy of man! Even I can't knock even you down, so there's a finality." She was not in the least angry, and as his arm fell away, said, "Well, I love you, so it is all right, but mind, I don't love you anything but brotherly." He did not care in the least whether she loved him or not. Such things belonged to tomorrow. They had stopped walking about, so she said, laughing at him, "If you will permit, let us sit down here, Sebastian, my dear." Sebastian's only notion was that he was happy, and that he was happier when he held Josephine round the neck, and seeing that he could do so better if they sat down, he seated himself on the dry clay of a rabbit-holed bank under a hawthorn tree. Whether Sebastian wanted to kiss her or talk, she did not know. She wanted to talk. "It is pleasant being loved," she said. "I like simple love best. I don't want to be on fire. I don't like walking about a flaming hell." Sebastian laughed and said, "I am not a flaming hell." "I didn't say you were," she answered. "I was thinking of what I used to be. I have been in love a lot of times." Sebastian had no desire to rake out other men's ashes, so he did not say anything, and she allowed herself to be supported by his arm, and gathering a few stalks of grass that grew near, began to eat them. There was really nothing to be done at the moment, so she became placid, and thought of Sebastian's vices and virtues, and of the vices and virtues of Blanchard, and suddenly, to her own surprise, she turned and hid her face in Sebastian's coat and began to cry. "What is it, Josephine?" he said. "Let's go home." "Home now?" "My dear," she said, "my dear," and allowed herself to be embraced and even kissed him back. "We are both sad and lonely," she said again, and yet, after a fashion, she felt happy. "The matter with me is," she went on, "after people disliking me, it seems more conspicuous now. I am sad in retrospect." "I am not sad and lonely," he replied. And youth and all the pleasures of love, made kind and tender, submissive and generous by 7 years of devotion, filled his heart. He stroked Josephine and kissed her and comforted her, and said he would take her home directly she wanted to go. "It is such a beautiful evening, I would like to stay a bit longer," she said, and both of them lost the last traces of worldly shortcomings, and for half an hour became, not heroic nor brave, but good and happy, with peaceful thoughts of heaven and earth. When night had fallen and the sky was filled with bright stars, the heroic part of existence came back to Josephine, and looking up from where she sat, sheltered by Sebastian's arm, she watched the movements of the heavenly bodies until she could endure to sit still no longer, and saying, "I am going home, don't come with me," ran away from her young man down the hill, filled with passionate thoughts which she did not find herself able to share with him. End of chapter 25, recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine.